Hello, my name is Alex Boruki, and this is part of Latin American Clips, Cortos Latinoamericanos. Here we are with Susan B. Coutin, who is Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society at the School of Social Ecology. Also there at Social Ecology, she's Associate Dean for Academic Programs. Hello, Susan. Great to see you.
Hello, Alex. It's so great to be here. I really am looking forward to our conversation.
Great. My first question to you is on your own work and how you see your current research on city-level enforcement of or resistance to federal level policy related to your previous work on El Salvador.
Sure. Thank you for that question. It's a great question. Let me give listeners a little bit of background about the work that I've done previously. I started off my research career writing about the sanctuary movement in the United States. So that was back in the 1980s, at a time when the US government had the stance that people who came to the United States from Central America were economic immigrants who deserved to be deported. And so that was a time when a movement arose to combat that attitude and to try to provide refuge for people. It was a religious movement made up of congregations that focused on people coming from El Salvador and Guatemala, and that argued that they were refugees who deserved to be in the United States. So that's really how I began working on El Salvador, was in this context of a social movement that was concerned about human rights violations and about the responsibility of people in the United States towards newcomers, towards people who arrived in their midst, right? And it was a movement that not only addressed immigration issues, but also US foreign policy. And, through accompaniment, through traveling to Central America, through challenging US military assistance and so forth. So I did that work back in the 1980s. Then between the 1980s and the 2000s, the early 2000s, I carried out several other projects that focused on El Salvador, or on Central America more generally. I followed the question of what would happen to people who had come to the United States during those civil wars after the wars ended. I followed that question in the subsequent years. So I did a study that looked at the activism on the part of Central American community organizations on behalf of Central Americans and by Central Americans, because those were organizations made up of Central Americans. I did that study that involved spending time in organizations in Los Angeles, doing field work within those groups, doing interviews with people who were seeking status in the United States. And that really acquainted me with the circumstances of not only asylum seekers, but also how their goals changed and their relationship to the United States changed over time, right? Where people began to settle in the United States, wanted to secure their status, not only out of a fear of persecution, but also because of the ties that had been established here and the lives they had created here. I did that work in the 1990s. In the early 2000s, I also did a study that looked very much, like you said, at transnationalism. What is the significance of the Central American population in the United States for the country of El Salvador, and also for the United States? Because as you may know, the Nicaraguan Adjustment and Central American Relief Act was one of the pieces of legislation that allowed people to continue, which was hard fought for by Central Americans themselves. But it was a piece of legislation that allowed Central Americans, certain Central Americans, to acquire status in the United States on the grounds that they lived in the United States for a considerable amount of time and would suffer a hardship if they were to be deported. But it only affected people who came in that earlier time period, right? And then I also did a project, and one of the things I realized when I was doing that project was that the experiences of young people who had been born in El Salvador but raised in the United States were very different from those who had come as adults, because they had, I recall an interview that really shaped my subsequent project. And that was an interview I did with a woman who told me about her experiences. She was in her 20s. She had a pending application under the Nicaraguan Adjustment and Central American Relief Act, but it was a time of this was either the late probably the very early 2000s or the late 1990s, and was trying, so her application was pending at that time. She didn't know what was going to happen. And I think it was the early 2000s. And she told me that during an interview that she had no memories of El Salvador. And yet she had no secure status in the United States. So she felt like she was invisible, because of that. And it was this really powerful image. She said she felt like she was invisible, like everyone else was solid, but she wasn't. And that was just, I thought, a really powerful statement about what it is to be in that kind of liminal or limbo state, and to not have a solid understanding of your country of origin or your future in the United States. So that led me to a project that focused on the experiences of people like her who'd immigrated to the United States. And that was my book, Exiled Home. So that's a lot of background, but I thought explaining how I got from those projects to where I am now, you kind of needed to know a little bit about those projects. So at that point, I decided to begin to collaborate with colleagues in our law school. And so with several colleagues, with Jennifer Chacon, who's now at UCLA, Samir Asher, and Stephen Lee, who are both in our law school, we started a project. This was back in around 2014, when at that time, there was great hope that there would be comprehensive immigration reform. And we thought that it would, we were optimistic that that would happen. And we developed a project we were intending to study. We thought if comprehensive immigration reform is launched, if it happens, and then if it's implemented, there's going to be groups who might be eligible on paper, but might not be able to qualify. And we were really interested in what those gaps would be and what challenges people would encounter, and the role of community organizations in facilitating, the process of overcoming those kind of barriers. So we began a study of that was intending to look at comprehensive immigration reform. Of course, comprehensive immigration reform did not occur. Instead, President Obama announced something called DAPA, which you might remember, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, and also an expansion of DACA. It was called DACA Plus, that would have expanded eligibility for DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And so we instead we switched our focus to looking at how DAPA, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, is implemented. Well, if your listeners are saying, DAPA, what's that? It's because there was a lawsuit filed by 26 states that led to an injunction, and DAPA was never implemented. And then the Trump administration rescinded DAPA. So it never happened, right? So we ended up doing a study of legal uncertainty. But one thing that this led me to, well, two things. I'm finally going to get to the answer to your question. Two things that led me to my current project that resulted from that was, one, we became very aware in our study. We were looking at Los Angeles County and Orange County, and we became very aware of really local differences in how counties responded, and even within counties, how cities responded in terms of promoting enforcement or trying to prevent enforcement. Santa Ana, for example, had a sanctuary initiative, right? And so we decided, so anyway, that made me very aware of this sort of local issue of enforcement. At the same time, deferred action is an administrative process, right? It's not a legislative fix. It's part of it's part of the discretion that officials have about how they're going to implement the law. Are they going to implement it against everyone? Are they going to not implement it, exercise what's called prosecutorial discretion? And so that made me very interested in administrative processes, right? So that's what led me to the current project. So Professor Walter Nichols and I, he's a faculty member in the Department of Urban Planning and Public Policy here at UCI, also in the School of Social Ecology. He and I launched a project to look at city level enforcement. And we are very interested in looking not at the classic things that people look at, which is the police, but rather what other processes do people have to engage with on a daily basis, very mundane aspects of city life that may not have anything to do explicitly with immigration, but that nonetheless, someone has to demonstrate that they're a resident in order to get city services. How are they going to do that? What kind of documentation are they going to need to provide? Will programs take their realities into account? Is there going to be outreach to these communities, immigrant communities, right? Like those kinds of questions. So we're kind of going beyond what people often call crimmigration, that is the intersection of criminal and immigration law, where there's been pressure on police forces to enforce immigration law at the local level. And some cities have tried to prevent that, and some communities have tried to prevent that. The state, but we're looking not at that kind of enforcement, but rather administrative processes and how those do or do not engage with immigration policymaking. And this is an effort to think through the role of very local community processes in promoting integration, inclusiveness, or in allowing federal definitions of citizenship, membership, and belonging to impose differentiation on members of their cities. So that's kind of the backdrop. That's how I got to this project.
Wow, it's fascinating, and I don't say fascinating a lot, especially because the very low level, micro level of regular people enforcing, not enforcing, and the underpinnings on that to the everyday level of experience of this is great. My second question goes to the present times that we are living, and particularly how COVID-19 has impacted your own work, your own research, but also the work of the people who are around you. And particularly also thinking of your position as Associate Dean for academic programs, that you have a unique perspective on this.
It's had a tremendous impact, as I'm sure you know, particularly on field research. Right? Mm-hmm. I myself am an ethnographer and I'm an anthropologist, and anyone who does field research, that's a type of research that really depends on immersing oneself in a social context. It's hard to do that in the current pandemic, right, where we all have to be social distanced. Everything's happening over the internet, right? So in terms of the project that Walter Nichols and I are carrying out, that led us to do a lot of work looking at what resources are available online. So we've been looking at, instead of immediately plunging into fieldwork, plunging into interviews, plunging into participant observation or something like that, we've done a lot of reviewing of websites, looking for reports, looking at, Facebook pages, collecting newspaper articles. There's actually a lot out there that you can glean from those types of sources. So we've been doing that. You can also do interviews over Zoom, as you and I are doing at this very moment. That's another way to do that. It's perhaps not ideal, but it has certain advantages. You can fit an interview into a day where you don't have to drive and park, right? But there's a few advantages. Busy people, it's probably easier for them to do an interview, the people you're trying to reach through interviews. And also participant observation can happen as well, right? You can participate in, it to the degree that social life is virtual right now. Like one thing that I've noticed with some of my students, for example, is that they're able to participate in processes that have now gone online, right? If what they were planning to study has let's say they're studying a program, mm-hmm. If that program has temporarily gone online instead of being in person, and if they can also participate online, they can still study it, And I think that one of my perspectives is that to the degree that virtual interaction is a part of the interaction that we have now, not only due to COVID, but it's part of our social life more generally. Even prior to the pandemic, for example, I recall for the project that I described, looking at DAPA, I recall participating in webinars as part of that. even prior to the pandemic, those things were occurring. And you can still do participant observation in that respect as well. So that's one thing. What I've seen for students is some students have dramatically changed their research. For example, doing surveys instead of in-person interviews, doing interviews online. Some students have resorted to things like using Facebook to recruit interview participants, things like that, right? That are available now. So, there's ways to do research. It just requires a lot of retooling. I think it's produced delays. Some are very frustrated because things that people intended to do, they can't. And so that's been hard. And especially if you put a lot of energy in, and for faculty, it might be possible to just postpone the project by a year. But for students, that's not so feasible. They still need to make progress towards their degrees. So they might have to postpone it to a project they'll do as a postdoc or something like that, right? So that's frustrating for students. But at the same time, I think as researchers, we're perhaps enriching our research toolkits in ways that we didn't anticipate. So that's me trying to look at the silver lining of this. It's a hard moment. I think a lot of students also have ended up studying, among other things, the impact of COVID on whatever process they intended to study anyway.
Yeah, to really be in the moment also,
right.
Which is part of what we are doing also here, providing evidence, testimony of these things that we are living through for them later to examine really the things that we went through indeed. Thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you. This was a pleasure. Really great to see you.
Good. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.